the aims of today's webinar. I think we've all probably either submitted or reviewed claims where we've looked to include the costs of preparing that claim, and either it's been struck out or we've decided not to include it, because it's pretty commonly accepted that you generally can't recover those claim preparation costs. So what we're going to do in this webinar is first we will look at why that situation has arisen, why it's so difficult to recover them, and then we'll look at some specific circumstances where it is possible for a contractor to recover the costs of his claim preparation. When we've done that, we'll take a look at the way in which you can recover them and what you need to do. And we'll look to see what the differences are between recovering the costs of an external consultant and recovering those costs where you've used your own in-house staff to compile the claim. So first of all, we'll look at claim preparation costs and why you generally can't get them, why the contract administrator will normally just put a line through them in red pen. And the reason for that is usually there's a contract provision that complies to the addresses recovery of claim costs. Usually you'll have some sort of provision within standard forms or bespoke forms that require you, as part of your contractual obligations, to submit a notice and then provide full particulars in substantiation. Or you'll find that the contract doesn't require you to submit claim documentation and will instead have provisions along the lines of submit your claim and then maintain sufficient records for the contract administrator to be able to ascertain your entitlement. So either the contract is just complying with an obligation under the contract to provide the particulars, and it's all included within his contract sum, or else providing the sort of detail within a full claim is not something that a contract requires. So either way, recovery is not allowed. And that's why we generally find it so difficult to recover the costs of claim preparation. However, there are certain circumstances where you can seek to recover the cost of preparing your claims. And that's what the next part of this webinar is going to run through. The first one we'll look at will be recovering costs as part of the dispute resolution process, where the process has been escalated to arbitration. Secondly, we'll look at recovering them directly as a head of claim, the justification for that and the way that we go about it. And finally, we'll look at recovering claim preparation costs as part of damages for breach of contract. But before we do that, we've got a poll that we'd like you to take part in. So I'll pass you back to Nina at this point and we'll undertake the poll.
Okay, thanks, Craig. Right, so a poll will be launching on your screen very shortly. Our poll for today, if everybody could just take a couple of minutes to answer. So how often do you include preparation costs within your claims? Always, mostly always, sometimes, or never? So we'll just give you a few seconds to enter your responses. Okay, so 31% say always, 0% mostly always, 23% sometimes, and 46% never. How does that sit with you, Craig?
I would say that's along the lines of what I was expecting. Certainly, in my own experience, I don't always put them in. There are some circumstances where I recognise that they wouldn't be recovered, but I do understand that it's a worthwhile tactic sometimes to include them, because it gives the contract administrator something that he can cross out, or something that you can use as a trade-off for something with a little bit more likelihood of recovering. Okay, so having conducted the poll, we'll move back to the presentation. And we talked about, just before we broke there, the three ways in which it's possible to recover them. Now, we won't spend a lot of time on this first one because most of the claims that we submit never go as far as arbitration. But generally, there will be a dispute resolution clause within our contracts, and that may give the option of arbitration. And if arbitration is invoked, we do have a situation as established under James Longley versus the Southwest Regional Health Authority, that an arbitrator, when awarding costs in the arbitration, they award costs for claims that were compiled, even if those claims were compiled prior to the commencement of arbitration. So if you've compiled your claim, you've had it rejected by your client, you've decided to take it further and invoke the dispute resolution clause. By the time that process is through, if you're successful and you're awarded costs, it is possible that you can be awarded the costs for your claim submission. Now, there are a couple of provisos here. The main one being that you can't change the content of your claim substantially. If you try to recover your costs in one way within your submission to your client, and then by the time you go to arbitration, you've turned it around and you're looking for a different claim, or you have different justification for your claim, it's unlikely that the arbitrator would allow you to recover the costs of the initial claim. You also need to be sure that the arbitral rules and the law of the arbitration are such that you're entitled to recover your costs of the claim. So the second way in which it's possible to recover your claims is a little bit more in line with what we normally do when we're submitting a claim, and that's to include it as a head of claim. This is the situation that I talked about briefly in the opening introduction as to why we tend not to get claim preparation costs paid. They're included as a head of claim, and they're then struck out by the contract administrator because they're not permissible under the contract. Well, there are precedents for recovering your preparation costs as a head of claim. Now, a lot of you, I imagine, will be familiar with the UK case of Walter Lilly versus Mackay. It's generally something that's cited when we're talking about global claims or we're talking about concurrency within claims. But as part of that judgment, the judge in the case, Mr. Justin Aikenhead, he concluded that you could recover professional fees as a head of claim, and the fees that he was talking about were for a consultant whose job had been, as part of that claim, to issue the notices and to work on the substantiation for the extension of time. So we should note that this was specific to a claim under JCT. I think it was JCT 98. And we shouldn't necessarily assume that this would be applicable to all standard forms or to bespoke contracts. However, from my understanding of that clause, I think it's clause 26 in JCT, I don't think there's any wording there that I think is unique to JCT and would preclude you from claiming somewhere else. So the basis on this is, if you're putting forward a head of claim that seeks to recover the costs of preparing that claim, cite Walter Lilly versus Mackay as your justification for doing it, and mention that it was held in that case that that professional fees incurred could be recovered as part of a loss and expense claim. And it just provides that little bit of justification and puts the weight of the law behind you, assuming, of course, that UK law is something that is applicable to the contract or the jurisdiction that you're working in. We'll now look at the third way in which it's possible to recover your claim costs. And this one is as damages for a breach of contract. And this arises in those situations where your engineer under a fitting contract, the contract administrator, architect, quantity surveyor under JCT, or the project manager and in NEC contracts, the person who's responsible for administering the contract, either independently or on behalf of the employer. If you as a contractor have fulfilled your obligations under the contract, but the contract administrator or engineer has failed to carry out his contractual obligations for issues such as granting you an extension of time that you believed you were entitled to, issuing or confirming instructions, reviewing claims within the time that he's required to review them in, or even things like properly preparing the payment certificate to include the items that you need to be into it. And again, we go back to the case of James Longley versus the Southwest Regional Health Authority. And what that did was establish that if the contract administrator didn't comply with his obligations under the contract, and it caused the contractor who had complied with his obligations to give notice and provide the information for review, then the contractor can claim for the additional costs. These would be costs that would arise from a secondary breach. The first breach has occurred where perhaps you haven't had access and you've been entitled to an extension of time, and that's fine. They're all activities that you have to do as part of your contractual obligations. But then when the contract administrator fails to deal with the submissions that you put forward, then there's a secondary breach. And that's something that in James Longley, it was held that the contractor could pursue his additional costs. So just to recap there then, we looked originally at the circumstances why we can't recover the additional costs of putting together a claim, and the contractual reasons why that's the position. Then we looked at the three circumstances where you could potentially recover costs. One as part of an arbitration that we'll put to one side, and then secondly as a head of claim under the contract, or as damages for a secondary breach of contract that you could perhaps use as support for a head of claim under the contract. So we've seen that there are certainly grounds within your contractual claim for putting your case forward for being paid for your costs. So the next stage then is to look at what can you recover and how would you go about it? How would you maximize your chances of recovering your costs? And there's two real circumstances that we need to look at. Whether you can benefit from using consultants to write your claim and recover those costs, or whether you can use your staff and still be able to claim those costs. I've submitted lots of claims where the contract administrator, having initially ruled out recovery of any costs because it's claim preparation, will then give me a further reason and say, well, hey, anyway, you haven't incurred any extra costs. These are your people, they're your staff. You would have incurred that cost anyway. What's the loss? What's the additional expense? And so there's an extra reason there for contract administrators to reject claims that use staff costs, even if they haven't rejected the claim preparation costs as a head of claim anyway. So let's first look at staff costs and whether or not they can be reclaimed. Okay, the case that's most useful in this one is Tate Lyle versus the GLC in 83. And what this one did was it established that where there was some sort of default on the other party, it's possible to claim and recover your damages for your expenses directly attributable to that breach. And in terms of construction claims, that's where you would use your own staff on recovering the claims costs, where you would bring in your planner to do the delay analysis, where you might take a quantity surveyor away from measurement duties to do some quantum work on a prolongation claim, where you might tie up your project manager for a few days or a few weeks, going through his diary and dealing with the events that caused the claim. Those are all circumstances where managerial and supervisory staff can be put forward for recovery within a construction claim. Now, the Tate Lyle case required a couple of things to be demonstrated. The first one was that it showed that your staff had been moved from their normal duties. And in all of those circumstances that I outlined, you could reasonably argue that if you take away the QS from the measurement and move him to the quantum of the claim, we're going to fall behind on the measurement. If your planner is putting together the delay analysis, he's not carrying out his standard day-to-day scheduling. If your project manager is sat down in meetings with your claims staff or your claims coordinator, he's not doing his normal project management duty. So it should be reasonably easy to establish that staff are being moved from their normal duties. Tate Lyle also required that it shows that the claims cause disruption to the business. Now, in these circumstances, again, you look at what the staff were doing. Would the project have moved along a little bit better if they'd been doing their normal course of work, their normal activities? For other staff that you might seek to bring into the claim, perhaps at a director level, has that disrupted the business by stopping them going out seeking other business? If it's a regional manager, would he have spent more time on other projects within his region? So again, it's for construction claims, that's something that it's not too difficult, I think, to establish. Interestingly, the Tate and Lyle case, the claim failed. Whilst the precedent was and the principle was established, unfortunately, the record keeping wasn't good enough, and the claimant wasn't able to show that the staff had been moved from their normal duties, had carried out the claim preparation work, or that there was disruption. And I think that just emphasizes something that as claims professionals, we're all very well aware of the importance of record keeping and what it's needed for. And Tate and Lyle gives us a classic example of something where the failure to keep records was something that backfired on the contractor and stopped him being able to pursue his claim for claim preparation costs, despite the judge concluding that it was perfectly acceptable. Now, that one didn't work, but we had a case 7 years ago. It's a case that the title's about a paragraph long, so I'm going to refer to it by its common usage name of Liverpool Museums. And this similarly was a case of a contractor who sought to recover the staff costs, again without records. And this one went to court, and it involved the director of the claimant having to state her case and convince the judge that the staff had been moved from normal duties, had been dealing with the claims, and which had caused disruption to the business. Unfortunately, the case went in their favor, and they were able to recover their claim preparation costs. So whilst I wouldn't recommend you rely upon that, and I would say it's much better to keep adequate records, it is entirely possible with the Liverpool Museums case and subsequent reaffirmations to recover your costs of claim preparation in those circumstances where the contract administrator or engineer hasn't carried out their obligations in accordance with the contract, even if you don't have the records. So that's in-house staff costs, and we've looked at the cases that give you the opportunity to try and recover those costs and what you need to do. For the case of consultants costs, it's a little bit easier. In the case of claims consultants, sometimes you need them. Sometimes you don't have the in-house staff that have the capability or have the time to carry out activities such as a time impact analysis, or to do a measured mile review of disruption, the sort of things that are needed sometimes to establish your case, but you don't have the time or the capabilities with your in-house staff. Well, the good news is with consultants costs, it's a little bit easier. As long as they satisfy the requirements that we've set out in terms of being able to include for them within either the arbitration claim or as a head of claim or as damages for a secondary breach of contract. With a consultant, as long as you've got the records that demonstrated what they did, you can just include them as a cost, as we saw in the Walter Lilly versus Mackay case. And as long as their costs are clearly identified and justified as to what they've been doing, it's that little bit simpler in that you don't have to demonstrate that they were moved from other duties or they were or that carrying out the claim was disruptive to the everyday flow of the business, because they're an external cost. They're an outsourcing activity. So just to recap, we started off and we looked at the familiar situation of being refused your claim preparation costs because they're not recoverable. You know, the old chestnut, no, you can't get that. We don't often look into why you can't get that, but today we've looked into it and we've seen that the reason is it's because of your contractual obligations, either to produce full particulars and substantiation as part of your contract obligations, or that your obligation is merely to provide a notice and to retain the records for the contract administrator to ascertain your entitlement. Then we looked at the three reasons why or where you may be able to recover claim costs. We looked at recovering them as part of the costs awarded in the arbitration process. We then looked at including them as a head of claim, and we looked at the justification in Walter Lilly versus Mackay for recovering those costs and the precedent there. So that's always worth considering quoting. And then we looked at the reasons for recovering them as damages for a secondary breach, where the contract administrator has failed to fulfill his obligations. Now, what I would say in that final one is, you've probably, for those of you that experienced this, you'll have had the contract administrator or the engineer putting forward a defense that the only reason he couldn't fulfill his obligations was because the contractor didn't provide a claim that was good enough to assess, that you didn't provide sufficient particulars. And generally, with a lot of the clauses being fairly vague, that you must do things as soon as reasonably practicable, or as soon as you are aware to the best of your ability. There are a number of sort of catch-alls that give the engineer or the contract administrator a way of justifying his failure to fulfill his obligations. So my advice would be, if you're going to try and use the third way of justifying your claim for recovery of claim preparation costs, you need to make every effort to ensure that as a claimant, as a contractor, you fulfilled all of the obligations that you're required to. And then finally, we looked at the ways you believe you are entitled to recover some of your claim preparation costs, what you would need to do, particularly in terms of in-house staff. And generally, that is, you've got to establish that using those staff caused disruption to your business and that it took them away from their everyday activities. That's as per the Tate Lyle case. And then obviously keep good records so that you can demonstrate both of those occurrences. If you haven't got good records, all's not lost. There's the Liverpool Museums case and similar cases that provide a subsequent opportunity for those situations where you haven't got the records. But as ever, if you can get the records, it's so much the easier. So that's the end of our presentation today on the circumstances in which you can potentially recover your claim preparation costs. Thank you very much for your time and for listening to me. I've enjoyed speaking to you for the last 20 minutes or so. And if you've got any questions, I'd be quite happy to address them as best I can now.
Thank you very much, Craig. And just before we go over to questions, sorry if everybody couldn't see the webcam. We did have a couple of people message through. I think it's a Wi-Fi issue that the webcam wasn't working, but thankfully the audio was. So I'm sure you still got a lot of value from today's session. Right, so if you have any questions, please feel free to send them across now. You can use your question box, or as I mentioned earlier, if you'd like to ask your question live, just raise your hand. I'll unmute your microphone and you can ask Craig directly. Whilst we're waiting for questions to come in, I just wanted to share a bit of information. We've recently updated the membership criteria. So if anybody's looked at membership before and considered joining, we've now got 2 routes to membership for associate and member. Before it was just a single set of criteria. We now have routes A and route B. So I've shared the link through the chat box if you'd like to go and have a look at the membership criteria, just to see if perhaps you felt like you've not met the prerequisites. Maybe now these additional routes will help you to join at the level that you would like. So yeah, feel free to take a look and of course get in touch with us if you have any questions. Okay, our first question through is from Ahmed, who's asking, what is the breakdown for claim preparation? I take that to mean the process of preparing a claim.
That's quite a wide one, Ahmed. In terms of putting your claim preparation together, it depends on the type of claim that you're making. In terms of this webinar, we're only really looking at the claim costs for the preparation of the claim, and I would say for that you're looking at it's people that were involved. So you may have some of the time for a director, you'll have some of the time for your IT team, for your claims consultant. You might have some office space and costs, some sundries. If there's overhead that's applicable that you're not recovering elsewhere, you might want to include some of that. I wouldn't normally recommend it. I would take your overhead as a whole and include it elsewhere with the standard formulas. But in terms of claim preparation, it's generally individuals. If we're talking about an overall claim, what I would do is I'd direct you to some of the information that we have available within the Institute and some of the template documents that are exceptionally good for actually compiling your claim, putting all of the various heads of claim that you need in there, and the process that you would need to go through to establish the circumstances that the claim arises from, the conditions of contract that you're claiming under, and the circumstances that give rise to the claim. And then when you're putting your overall costs together, it's the costs that it's the loss of expense arising from the breach of the contract that arises. But that's a long. I've given you a long answer, but the real answer would be a whole lot longer. I would say take a shortcut, have a look at some of the templates and the guidance that we have within the library and the Institute.
Okay, so Alpha's asking, could we not consider that the cost of the claims has been included under the head office claims section?
You could do, but you're just as likely if you do that to have the claim preparation costs stricken out by the contract administrator. I think wherever you include your claim costs, whether it's in the head office activities, which is sometimes recoverable under your overheads, or whether it's a specific head of claim for claim preparation costs or damages arising from the secondary breach that we spoke about, the risk is still that the contract administrator or engineer will say, hey, those guys that you have in your head office, your claims director, your commercial manager, how much of their time was spent putting together that claim that you've submitted? I'm not paying for that. If you're entitled to an extension of time, I'm willing to pay for their costs for the period of prolongation where they're carrying out their regular duties, but you've got a contractual obligation to comply with the requirement for submitting full claim particulars. So I think where you include them in the claim cost is possibly not as important as the way you try and justify their inclusion. And my advice would be, wherever you include them, back up there that we've seen today, where you can argue that, hold on, Walter Lilly versus Mackay, assuming you are in a common law jurisdiction, that's always the proviso, says that it is possible to recover them. Likewise, Tate Lyle gives us the opportunity of recovering in-house staff management, and you can apply that backup to your recovery of claim costs, whether you have them in a general head office section or whether you have them in a specific head of claim. And if the contract administrator is as so many of them are, reluctant to pay for the costs of preparing your claim, you can defend that using this information, whichever section they're in.
And then we'll just go on to our last question from Satgunaraja. I hope I pronounced that correctly. What if the contractor failed to provide substantial supporting documents to prove a disruption claim? Can the contract administrator agree on a percentage of cost based on the measured mile method?
We have I think a couple of questions in the same question there. I think the first one about lack of substantiation from the contractor, that makes it very difficult for you to prove your claim. I mean, generally there's a contractual obligation that you must provide either sufficient substantiation for the contract administrator to make a decision on a claim, or alternatively, in those type of contracts where you just need to keep sufficient records, your record keeping must be good enough for the contract administrator to be able to do that. So if you don't provide good enough records in substantiation, it's very difficult for your claim to succeed. And it's also very difficult for you to try and say that the contract administrator has failed in his or her obligations under the contract. And that's, as I mentioned in the webinar, that's quite a common defense from a contract administrator, which I'm sure a lot of you have encountered. In terms of a measured mile approach, I'm a big fan of that in disruption claims. And as long as, and again, it all hinges on the quality of your records. You know, if you're able to provide records that show the extent to which you were effective before the event occurred that disrupted you, and then compare that, the measured mile approach, with a period of time where you were impacted by the event, and you can show the difference for disruption, I'm a big fan of that. I think there's there's not many better ways of establishing disruption. But as with everything, it hinges on the quality of records that that you have available and that you're able to put forward to the contract administrator for ascertaining the claim. I hope that answers the question there.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you to all of you for your questions. That's the last one, so I think we'll close things there. Just to say thank you again to everybody for attending today, especially if it's your weekend. If you do have any questions about the ICCP in general, about membership, drop me a line, and I'm always happy to have a chat with you, discuss anything to do with the Institute or any of the membership levels, and make sure that we can help you as much as we can. The final webinar in this public series will take place in April. Usually we send out the registration link in the follow-up email, but we won't be today. We've got a bit of a conflict in presenter schedules, but we'll get all of that straightened out. And check out our LinkedIn page our LinkedIn page for the announcement for registration. But that session will be all on the topic of adjudication. So hopefully you can join us for that, and if not, of course, the recording will be there as usual. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much, Craig, for an excellent presentation, and we hope to see you back again next month.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.